Ever wonder what a REST API is or when to use REST Web Services? Ever wonder how to create a custom REST API? In this video, Tami Lau is discussing REST services to help you on your path as a Salesforce developer and Salesforce architect. Welcome, it's Rachel and Jessica from 100 Days of Trailhead, the place where the tech community comes to learn Salesforce, learn tech, get inspired, and invest in ourselves. Whether you're brand new to learning Salesforce and starting from the beginning, or mid-career and skilling up for that new opportunity, we are your trail guides here to support you with an itinerary to help you get where you're going. You are in the right place. If you are new to our channel, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to click on the notification bell so you can be notified when we release a new video. In the description below, you can find links to everything we mention in this video, as well as books we and our friends have used along our Salesforce journeys. To find other helpful Salesforce and tech content, visit our blog at 100daysoftrailhead.com. Let's go! In this video, Tami will discuss what a REST API is and when to use REST Web Services. Tami is a Salesforce developer at Presence Product Group by day and an Oakland user group leader, Rad Woman coach, and Amplify regional leader by night. She is a Salesforce MVP somewhere in between. She also makes a mean blueberry pie. Your quest, should you choose to take it, is to journey with us through the adventure of learning REST Web Services. Your quest begins now. Our wonderful speaker today is Tami Lau, our very own WWDUG Tami Lau. She is a Salesforce developer at Sierra Club, where she combines her interest in technology with passion for mission-driven work. She participates in Women in Tech, Women Who Dev user group, and Amplify, formerly Girlforce. Shout out to Amplify. She graduated from the RAD program and is very excited to be a returning coach. So that is awesome that Tami is one of the coaches over there, and when she's not geeking out on Salesforce, you can find Tami doing yoga, cooking, reading a book, or hanging out with her cats, which we never knew about the cats. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tami.
You'll see I did a very developer thing by just reusing my RAD bio instead of writing a new one. That's why I talked about me returning as a coach. Okay, awesome. So today I'm going to be talking about Salesforce REST Web Services. As Rachel mentioned, I'm at the Sierra Club here in Oakland, California. I've been on the Salesforce platform for about 6 years now and developing for about 2, ever since I graduated from the RAD program back in 2016. So I'm still a relatively new developer. So I definitely don't have all the answers, but happy to share what I know with the rest of the group. And actually, I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can take a quick poll. How many of you here have used Apex REST Web Services? Great, a couple of you. How many of you have heard of it but haven't used it, don't know what it is? How many of you have no idea what I'm talking about? Oh, excellent. Okay, no hands there. So let me go back to sharing. Okay, I'm going to start off with some basics just to make sure we're all on the same page about what REST Web Services are, and then I'm going to talk sort of at a high level about how to write one and testing and tools and things like that. And then I'm going to walk through a real example, caveats to come, and go through actually like showing code and showing some of the testing tools and showing a REST Web Service in action. Okay, so starting off, one thing before I forget, feel free to ask questions at any point during this presentation. I think questions are best asked in context before you forget what you're asking about, so feel free to shout out any questions. And Jessica and Rachel, if I miss something in the chat, please just shout out at me. Thank you. I am a unitasker through and through, so can really only pay attention to one thing at a time. Okay, so what is an API? Starting off pretty high level. An API stands for Application Programming Interface, which is a software intermediary that allows 2 applications to talk to each other. Basically what that means is an API allows 2 systems to talk to each other rather than a user talking to a system. For example, Twitter has an API that allows other software like Hootsuite, like any third-party thing that you would download to send tweets, to retrieve tweets, post tweets on your behalf, interact with tweets, direct messages, and the like, without actually requiring you to log directly into Twitter. So you can log into Hootsuite. Hootsuite uses the API to send actions to Twitter to do it on your behalf. And Salesforce has an API-first approach. So almost anything you can do on the platform using UI, you can do using the API. So it provides for a really flexible platform to do almost anything you want it to do. So what are REST web services, which is a term I've been using a lot? Essentially, a REST web service is an API using the REST architecture. And so what does that mean? And I promise this is the most lecture-y part of the talk. The rest will be actually how do you do these things. But what does REST mean? In the REST architecture, your data and your functions, your code, are considered resources. And they're accessed using URIs, Uniform Resource Identifiers, which are typically links on the web. So they'll look like URLs a lot of the time. The resources are acted upon using a defined set of simple operations. So get, post, put, delete. You've probably seen some of these if you've ever read about an API. And it uses a client-server architecture. So the client is the system that's making the call and making the request. And the server is the system that's responding to the request. So in this case, where we're building a REST web service on Salesforce, Salesforce is the server, and whatever system is making the request of Salesforce is the client. And REST architecture is designed to be stateless. And so each request is a separate transaction, and you don't maintain state between requests. So what does this actually mean in real life? Why would you use a Salesforce REST web service? Basically, you would use a REST web service to allow an external application to access your Salesforce data and your Salesforce functions. Because it's based on the REST architecture, it's super lightweight, it's scalable, it's really easy to build, and it's really good for what we call loosely coupled integrations. And what I mean by loosely coupled is that you can make changes in one system without necessarily having to reflect those changes on the other system. So for example, if I have Salesforce as my server and I have a REST API that allows someone to get contact information, I could add new fields in Salesforce and I wouldn't necessarily have to change my API. The client that's calling that wouldn't necessarily need to know about those new fields. You don't need to reflect changes in both systems. They're not tightly integrated. Salesforce does have a REST API by default that's available for you, and I'm not going to go into all the details of that default API, but there's a lot of functions in it. You can use it to get records, get record details. You can use it to create records. You can use it to update records, et cetera, et cetera. And I've included 2 examples of standard Salesforce REST calls that you can make. So you can make a get call to grab details about a specific record, and you can also make a post call to create a new record. You can also make a put call to update a record, etc. Or if you don't want to use the default API, you can write a custom API with completely custom logic that will do whatever you tell it to do. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Are there any questions so far before I move on? Awesome, okay. So what is a REST API? And this is where we get into the fun details. So basically a custom REST web service in Salesforce is simply just an Apex class that has some special annotations. So at the top level, you would annotate it with the @REST resource URL mapping. And that part in green that says custom REST API is anything you want it to be. That's just going to be the endpoint of your API. The class has up to 5 global static methods annotated with the different predefined requests that you can make in REST. So get, post, delete, put, and patch. And that's typically used for getting records, creating records, deleting records, and editing records. Don't ask me what the difference between put and patch is, I don't know. You can only have one of each type, because when you call the API, you're basically giving it that URL mapping and you're giving it the method. So if you have more than one method, that's a get, for example, it wouldn't know which one to do. So you can only have one of each type. And then when you call your API, the base endpoint is going to be your Salesforce instance, whatever that is, /services/Apex REST / whatever that name in green is that you gave it. And one thing to note, this is case sensitive. So if you give it an uppercase letter, use the uppercase letter when you're calling it. Otherwise, it's going to say this resource doesn't exist. Most things in Apex are not case sensitive. This is.
So Tami, Liz mentioned patch is like upsert.
Ah, perfect. Thank you, Liz. Fellow rad coach to the rescue.
Representation of our community effort.
Awesome. Okay. And then other objects you'll be using when you're working with your REST API. REST context is the object that contains REST request and REST response. REST request is the object that's used to pass data from your HTTP request to your API service. So that's going to hold the request from your client that gets passed to the server. And then REST response, it's what's used to hold data that's passed from your service back to your client. And this will make more sense when we go through our actual example. Anything that's in red here is a link to Salesforce docs or some other reference, and I'll post the slide deck after this so you have all these links. Okay, returning a response. So what happens when someone calls your API? What do you give back to the person who's calling? So by default, your call will return a response code and a message. I have a link there to all the valid responses that are returned. By default, Salesforce, if you don't tell the API to do anything, it will return one of these codes. 200, which means okay, the call succeeded, it didn't hit anything that caused an error. 401 means unauthorized, which means you didn't pass in a session ID, you didn't authenticate. Or 500, which covers any other error that it hits. You can choose to also return data. So for example, if someone is calling a get method to get a list of something, you should probably return the list of that something so that they have it. You can also, if you are creating a new record, you can return the ID for that record back to your caller so they can record it in their system. And you can also manually set the response code to any of the valid codes. So by default, there's one code, for example, that I think means the record is created. By default, Salesforce would return 200. Okay, everything went well. You can also say, actually, I want it to return this other code. I think it's a 201 or something like that. If you try to assign it a code that's not one of the valid codes, there's actually a different code that says that's an invalid code. And then responses get assigned to that REST response object that I mentioned briefly earlier. All right. Authentication. How do you authenticate into a REST API? There's a couple of different things you can do. In order from least secure to most secure, you can actually put a REST API onto a site and make it public to anybody. So it's public, it's anonymous, anybody with the URL can access it and send data to it. So what you do is you create a site, you add the Apex class to the site guest user's profile, and then the URL would slightly change. It would be the site URL versus your instance URL. You can make it public, but require an API key. So that's a string that the caller has to pass that you verify is correct before you do any processing. And so that makes it, it's still public. Someone could still get the API key and call this, but it's not completely public. And custom metadata types work great to store these API keys. And that's, in my example, that's what I'll be showing is an API key using a custom metadata type. And then the most secure is actually to use OAuth. And so then the caller has to use OAuth to grab a session ID and then pass the session ID along with their call. Before I move on to testing tools, anybody have any questions about any of that? All right, so testing APIs can be a little bit tricky. You can't always, it's not always practical to use your Salesforce instance, or sometimes if you have a client, the client doesn't have like a test instance that you can use, so that it can be a little tricky to test. So there are a lot of testing tools out there that make this easier. On the left-hand side, I've listed some client emulators, so things that will send API calls to servers. Workbench will do this with your Salesforce instance, which is great. There's an online one called Hurlit. There's Soap UI, which is what I use. One I've heard of, Postman, and I'm sure there's many more out there. These are just ones I've heard of that are popular. So those are ones that will send requests. You can also emulate the server side, and there are services out there that will receive REST API requests, so you can see what the call in looks like. What I had used before was RequestBin, which unfortunately has been discontinued. And I found these other ones I haven't used as extensively, putsrec.com and mockable.io, which also work. I think mockable.io is nice because you can manually set what response you send back. So it's a little bit more realistic than some of the other ones. For example, RequestBin only took in the request so you could see what it looked like, but you couldn't send back specific response codes for your testing. So these are good ways to test APIs sort of in middle stages. And then our favorite topic with Apex, unit testing. So like all Apex code, you can write test classes for your REST web services to get your test coverage. The only difference is that instead of actually having something calling into your API, you would use the add header and add parameter methods to kind of mock an incoming REST request. And I'll have some demo test code that you can look at what that looks like. All right, so that was the talking part. The next part is going to be actually going through a demo of what this looks like. I'm going to go through a semi-real life example, and I say semi because my real life code actually uses 100% custom objects. I did not think that would be very interesting to anybody. So what I did is I took the code and I adapted it to use all standard objects. So you have a better sense of what it could look like in your org. So the real life example I got was about a year ago, where we have a chatbot on Facebook Messenger. I don't know if anybody's used Messenger and interact with a chatbot, but the chatbot will send out things like, hey, here's some content I think you might be interested in based on your past interactions. Hey, it's Earth Day, come out to an event. Hey, here's a petition we're setting up to ask, so-and-so senator to pass this bill. Can you add your name to the petition? And if the person responds back and says yes, or yes, I'll sign the petition, we want to record that in Salesforce as an action so that we know the person responded and said yes to this particular ask. The screenshot is the documentation I had for this API. I know it looks like just a screenshot, but this is basically all I had to go on. In ChatFuel, they call it a JSON API, and what you can do is set it so that when someone does a certain thing, you can send a HTTP request to a URL of your choice. So that little part with the URL, you can plug in whatever URL you want, and then you can add whatever attributes you want off of Facebook to send along with that. Seeing as this is all I had to go on, what did I do? So this is sort of my process for how I approached this. The first step was to figure out what the incoming data looked like. It's called the JSON API. I had assumed it would send the call in JSON. I was wrong, so it was a good thing I had a server emulator to call to figure out what that looked like. So what I did was I set up a request bin, And I grabbed that URL and I gave it to the person who manages our chatbot. And I said, hey, can you plug this URL in, take a couple of test actions, and then I'll go look at what the data looked like. So she did that. And it turns out instead of actually sending it in JSON, it sent the data in form encoded, URL form encoded format. So good thing I did some testing, because otherwise I would have been coding for JSON and that's not what it was. The second step was to figure out how I could replicate that, because I didn't want to have to ask her to take this test action every time I wanted her to, every time I made a tiny tweak to it, I didn't want to have to ask her, hey, can you take this action again? I can say, hey, can you do this again? I wanted to be able to do it myself so that I could test as much as I wanted. So for that, I used SOAP UI, which I will demo, and basically played around with it until I replicated the call exactly. So I got the call in request bin looking exactly like it had looked coming from Facebook. And then I used that and I plugged in my Salesforce URL so I could do testing in Salesforce. So that's how I use those two tools to figure out how to replicate data and test. What are my options for authentication? With this particular system, I had none, because ChatFuel is pretty basic. It just sends out the call. It was not capable of doing a follow-up call, for example, to get a session ID and then to be able to make a second call with authentication. And they didn't do anything with returning data. So I chose to go the API key route, so that I had some authentication. People couldn't just fill our instance with junk contacts, but also they wouldn't need to actually use OAuth and authenticate in. What do I do with the incoming data? We'll go through that in our test demo code, and then data exceptions we'll talk about later as well. Okay, so demo time. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show you is what the custom metadata type looks like for my API key. Let's see. So I just called it API key, pretty simple. And what I chose to do is I gave it a, put a custom field on it called key, which is the key that the person should send. But I also chose to use the label and the name as like I called it a key name. And so I asked ChatFuel to actually send both of those back to us, the key and the key name, and I compared them in my code. And that way, the idea was that the API then would be a little bit more extensible. We could have other vendors using it, just sending a different key name and key pair. And if we needed to revoke access to one of them for some reason, we didn't have to shut the whole thing down. We could just remove or modify one vendor's key, and that wouldn't affect the other vendor. So it made it a little bit more complicated, but hopefully a little bit more reusable. So that's my custom metadata type. And then to show you what the data looks like, let's go manage our records. I have two in here. I have my www.dug key, and I have my test key that I use in my test class. So if I look at this record, you can see my key name is www.dug, and the actual key is www.dug rocks. All right, so that's what I'll be using in my demo. Let's see if I can find the right tab. Okay, so onto Dev Console. What does this code actually look like? Is the size okay for everyone? Excellent. So here's my basic activity API. Here's that annotation, the REST resource with my URL mapping. And I chose to call this activity API, and I gave it a version. So this is version 1. You can see it's a global class. Everything has to be global in here. And I called it activity API. Your class name and your URL mapping don't have to match. In this case, I did make them match, but they don't have to. And then I have one method in here, which is a post. So this takes incoming data and it creates records. So I have a global static method called create activity. And then, as I said, the incoming data actually came in as a form URL encoded. And this gets into some of the details of how this works. But basically, if it's a form URL encoded request, Salesforce knows that and maps all the values that are sent as, puts them in the REST request params map. That seems a little esoteric, but so what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new REST request, and I am grabbing that from the REST context request. And then I'm creating a new map called params, which grabs the parameters from the request. And then I'm just assigning each parameter into its own string so that I can use it in my code. And then I'm going to grab my API key so I can do some comparison and make sure that I know who this request is coming from. So to grab custom metadata type, it's just like grabbing any custom object record from Salesforce, except that this does not count against your SOQL limit. It looks like SOQL, it does not count though because it's custom metadata type, which is great. So I'm grabbing my keys. So I'm just grabbing any key from custom metadata type where the name of the key equals the key name that I grabbed in my parameter up here. So that's how I'm doing the comparison. And then I'm assigning the key from that record into a string called compare key. Pretty simple. And I'm just grabbing the first one. So hopefully there's not more than one, but if there is, I'm just grabbing the first one. So then I say, if the compare key matches the key that was passed, so compare key is what I grabbed from my custom metadata type, and key is what was passed in the request. So only if they match, then I continue with this processing. So if someone sends something that doesn't match, I'll send back an okay response, but nothing's gonna happen here. One of the parameters that was passed was a campaign code, which is just a string. So I'm using that code here to try to grab a campaign. So I'm selecting the ID from a campaign where the ID equals that code. Because what if they pass you something that's not an ID? What do you can't assign that to a lookup field if it doesn't actually exist. So I'm checking to make sure the campaign actually exists. And if the campaign is not null, then I continue and see if there are any existing contacts with that first name and last name. So I'm using all those parameters that were passed to see if there are existing contacts. If that list isn't empty here, then I'll create a task using the first contact on that list. So if there are duplicates, I'm just gonna grab the first one and use that. And what I'm doing is I'm calling a private inner method that I'll show down below. And the private inner method takes a campaign ID, contact ID and a campaign ID, and it creates a task using those two IDs. So that whole section was if I found existing contacts. If I didn't, I'm actually gonna create a new account contact pair. So I'm gonna create an account using the first name, last name. I'm gonna insert it, and then I'm gonna create a contact using that first name, last name email, and then assign it to the account I just created. Apparently I was debugging at some point. I insert the contact, and then I use that new contact and I call my inner method here again, passing the contact ID and the campaign ID. So you can see why I use the inner method. There are two places in this code where I'm potentially creating a task. If the contact exists and if the contact doesn't exist. And I didn't want to have to repeat code. So I put that code in a private method instead and called that in each place so that I didn't have to write this out twice. What this inner method does is it takes that contact ID, it takes that campaign ID, creates a new task with a default subject. It associates the task to the contact via the who ID and to the campaign via the what ID. It gives it an activity date of today and a status of completed, and it inserts the task. So all done. You can see that I'm not returning anything here in any place. So the caller would simply just get a 200 if this worked, and a couple other error messages, which I'll show you as well. Any questions about the class?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, did you think about using like save points? I haven't with Salesforce used them that often, but I wasn't sure. So this way, if it fails doing one of them, it rolls back.
Yeah, I had not, but that is a good thing to consider. Although I think because this is considered one transaction, if it failed, I think the whole thing would roll back.
That has a different insert. No, because if you do different insert parameters,
Yeah, that'd be a good thing to test.
Can you explain more what that meant?
Explain what?
Can you explain more what that meant, the save point? What does that mean?
Oh, let me see if I can get back to that tab without closing everything. So Tina, I think you meant like after, say, this, or before this insert, right? Put in a save point there.
and I'm not saying to do it. I'm just wondering if, I know with Salesforce, I haven't really used them that much, but I was just thinking about it, so.
Yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't considered it for this. It's a pretty simple example. Yeah. I am curious now though, if it would, let's say it was a bad email and it tried to assign this email to its email field and it failed, would it have created the account without anything else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We'll have to play around with that and see.
So I think that there's a question around terminology. Tina, do you mind explaining what basically in lay terms, what you were asking in lay terms? Just to level the ground for everybody.
Just if, because I would save points, and if it was like a consideration or not, or try to just say nothing particular.
Well, I think some people might not know what a save point is.
Oh.
And it's it's like a method that's available off the database class that Salesforce provides, an Apex class, right? So you can, so like in code, you can, and I think Tami, you might be trying to find it right now, the where it's like database.savePoint, and then do you later say, so you're basically saying, hey, if something fails, I want you to roll back to my save point. And then okay, so there's a save point.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a database.rollback.
So there's the save point. There's some other processing here, and then here they roll it back to the save point. So then it's as if this part never happened.
Yeah.
Because you roll back to where your save point was.
Got it. Thank you.
And it's useful, like if you need for sure to have all the data saved at once and you can't just have pieces of it. So.
That helped clear things up for me. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know what you meant by that. I'm like, I don't know what I meant to ask. Just wondering.
It's just, we have people at all different levels. So, sometimes with jargon, that's all. That's all. We just try to really define. But
okay.
Thank you for bringing it up, and thank you, community, including Liz, for helping clarify for everybody, including me.
Awesome. So I'm going to demo calling that basic API using Workbench. So if anybody's never seen Workbench and APIs before, this is actually a pretty cool tool. So if you go to utilities, there's a REST Explorer that allows you to make REST API calls into your Salesforce instance. So what I'm going to do is I am actually going to create a post into my custom API. So REST. And here's my case-sensitive API URL. I have this saved, so I don't have to type. So there's my request body with all my parameters. I'm basically sending in my first name, last name, email, a valid campaign code, that key name and key pair that we talked about earlier. And then the key thing I need to remember to do is change the header so that it is not JSON. I'm sending a form encoded content. So that is a call, and actually to verify what we are doing, I'm going to find my contact and show you there should be no activities on it right now because I deleted all my tests. So no activities on this contact. If I go back to my REST Explorer and I hit execute on this, you'll see I get a raw response, 200 OK. And if I go back to my contact and refresh, fingers crossed. Oh, here's my action right here. So I create an activity that was action taken, has a date of today, and it's related to this campaign, www.dug demo, which I had passed in as a code. All right. Next thing I wanted to show you was actually how to put it in.
Christopher said magic, by the way. That's pretty awesome.
APIs are magic. All right, so here is my site, my www.dug site, and I have actually added that API to this site. So I'm going to show you what that looks like real quick before I go and call it, if it loads. Here we go. So here's my custom site. And if I go to public access settings, here's my site guest user profile. And you can see in enabled Apex class access, I've added my activity API as a class that the site can access, which is how I made it public. So switching gears, I am going to go to SOAP UI, which is my testing tool of choice for sending API calls. You can see I use it for a lot of things in my real work life. But for the purposes of our demo, let's see. Here's a call that is going to fail. And I say that because you can see this URL is just my regular instance URL with all that rest that I showed you. And this is going to fail because I'm not authenticated here. And as you know, if you're just calling your instance URL, you need to be authenticated with OAuth using a session ID in order to access it. So this is the exact same call I had pasted in earlier with all the same parameters. And if I call this, if I submit this, you'll see down here, very small here, 401 unauthorized. Can't do it because I did not pass a session ID. But if I go to this version here, request one here, I don't know if this is too small to see. This endpoint is actually my site endpoint. So this is that custom site that I had created called REST Demo instead of my actual instance name, which was Wave DevEd. It's called that because this was my original Wave dev org. And I figured this was one of my least messed up orgs to demo in. So this is the site URL versus my instance URL. And if I call this here, it should actually work because by calling the site, I don't need the authentication. And I'm actually gonna change this to, let's see, let's do Rachel. I don't think Rachel exists in my org yet. If I submit this, fingers crossed, in my header, you see I got a 200 OK. And if I go to my org, accounts, Let's make it faster. Here we go. Here's my account and contact for Rachel. And you can see it was just created by the site user right now, 5:41 p.m. Pacific, because the API had not found anybody with that first name, last name, email match. So it just went ahead and created this new account and contact, and it created that action on her. So then I wanted to show you what happens with something slightly different.
Medina says amazing.
Thank you.
So we have magic and amazing. So I think, you know, that's like, I don't know, unicorn, Sasquatch, something.
Actually, I'm going to do this part in Workbench because the error message is a little easier to see, I think, in Workbench than in SOAP UI. But what happens if I send bad data? So let's say I send this as my email. It's clearly not a good email. If I hit execute on this, again, Apex error.
Rita asked, if you send it again, will it create a dupe? She asked previous to this last action.
Gotcha. It will not create a dupe account contact because it's doing that search by first name, last name, email. But it will create another action. So the API is not, what's the term for it? I just learned it. I actually don't know how to pronounce it. Idempotent? There's a term for
Idempotent.
Idempotent, thank you.
But I can't explain it, so can you?
Something that is idempotent is handles errors well. So let's say there was a hiccup on your client side and you sent this request 4 times. Something that's idempotent would only create 1 record, whereas this would actually create 4 records because it's not checking for that action to see if it's been sent today. So a couple of things I could have done to make it idempotent, include an external ID on the action if your other system has external IDs. I could check to see if that action already existed for that contact on that day and not create it if it already existed. I could check if that action existed for that contact for that campaign period, right? If you only want the person to take action on that campaign once ever. So there's a couple of additional checks I could have done to make it a little bit more robust. As it stands right now, it would just create the record over and over if you kept calling it. There's a lot going on in chat right now. Let's see. I don't know where my chat window went. Okay, awesome. Okay, so that was what a bad request looked like. You would just get an Apex error because what happened was when this tried to insert a contact with that email, it couldn't because that's not a valid email address to put in the email field. And actually, that's a great thing to check. Did it create the account, right? Because the account creation happened before the contact creation. And it didn't. There's still only 1 account. So maybe that answered the question about the rollback. And then the last thing I wanted to show was, or last two more things I wanted to show. One was how to use one of those server emulators. And bear with me, I've never actually used either of these two since my preferred one has been discontinued, but I did want to show you what that would look like. So I'm going to create one of these. And these are temporary. They usually only last 24 or 48 hours, something like that. So it doesn't persist. So this URL will go away probably within the next 2 days. So here's, they give this URL. And you can see there's been 0 requests to it so far. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to SOAP UI. Close out these 2. I'm going to create a new REST service from URI. So I'm going to put in that URL I just got, say OK. Let's go ahead and copy that call again. Post gives me a body. And then let's make sure to change my content type here. And if I post that, and then I go back to my, you can see now there's been one request. And that's the request I just made to it. And it is down here. So you can see these are the headers that it came with. And this was the request that I sent. So that's one way you could see what a request looks like before you actually try to code around it. All right, and then okay, I keep saying one last thing, but this is truly second to last thing is unit testing. So what does a unit test look like? I did promise I would show you. So here's my test class. It has the @IsTest annotation, and it has a test method for an existing contact. I'm gonna set up my test data. I'm inserting an account, a contact, and a campaign to test against. I'm gonna start my test, and I'm gonna manually recreate these REST requests and REST response objects here. And then here's the part I talked about where I am manually adding parameters to my call. So you can see I put in the URI, I'm calling it a post method, and I'm adding all these parameters manually to my request in my test. And then to actually call the method, I just call the class activity_API.createActivity, which is the name of my method, and then I stop my test. So at that point, I can do my assertions. I am asserting that we have not created a new contact record, because in this case, it should be an existing contact. So I'm saying there's still only one contact in the system. And I'm asserting that we've actually created a task. So that there is a task in the system that belongs to that contact. And then I'm doing a test method for a new contact. So I set up the same data as before. Everything looks exactly the same here, except I'm sending a different name and email here. So this should actually create a new account contact in the system. And you can see one thing I want to point out is that I actually use a testing key in my test class. That's different than my live key. And the reason for that, and if you're using real keys, they should actually be a little more secure than just testing key. But the reason for that is if I needed to revoke a live key for some reason, let's say we stopped doing business with a vendor, we don't want them to continue sending data, or for some reason, we didn't want a key to be live anymore, I could just go and deactivate that key and I would not have to go back and edit my test class. My test class would still pass because I would still have the testing key in there. And then I'm going to call the class, stop my test, and this time my assertion is that there's now 2 contacts in the system, because my setup had created 1, and then when I ran the API, it should have created a second. So I'm asserting that I have 2 contacts now, and I'm asserting that I only have 1 task associated with my new contact. So just making sure I'm not creating errant tasks all over in the system. And then I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I wrote a version that takes JSON as well, because JSON is actually a more common way to send requests. And it looks a little bit different. So for this one, you can see I called it version 2. So versioning is the best practice if you're going to be making changes to how your API functions. That way, if anybody out there is calling your first version, you don't break what they're doing by rolling out a new version. So it's very easy to do. You just put a version number in your URL and make sure they call the right one. And when you're receiving JSON, sounds a little, it's gonna sound a little weird, but if your function, so this function here, create activity, accepts parameters, so this one does, it accepts all these string parameters, the JSON, that's being sent will be deserialized into the provided parameters automatically for you. So as long as your JSON parameters, like the names, match these, then it will automatically actually put them in here for you. So there's not all that thing about grabbing the parameters from the request. And then the rest of the code looks exactly the same. And then one final thought, just mention about this code. I have all this code in the gist that's in the slides. So you can take all this sample code and do whatever you want with it.
Nadina said, that's why I love JSON.
Well, I thought I was working with JSON when I got the initial spec for this, but it turns out the JSON API doesn't send JSON. Who would have guessed?
Interesting.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about assumptions and error handling. So you know what you're all getting into using my demo code. The demo code does assume that all fields are sent, but there are no nulls anywhere. And the only thing I check for is campaign. If the campaign doesn't exist, I don't do anything. The code just moves on, it sends an okay response. It doesn't send back an error or anything. And that's partly a function of the Chatfuel API that I was working with, is they don't do anything with the response. If I send back an error, they're not gonna do anything with it. So I chose to write my code in a way that, you know what, if you send a bad campaign, I'm not gonna do anything, I'm just gonna move on. When you're actually writing your own API, you should actually think about what the caller could actually send and what you want the result to be. So in this demo code, if they send a null first name, for example, this would result in a contact with no first name and only a last name, which is default Salesforce behavior. If they sent a null last name, you would get an Apex error because Salesforce requires a last name. If you sent a bad email or a null campaign, also Apex error because the code is assuming there's a campaign code. It's checking to see if that's a real campaign, but it's not checking to see if there's a null in that parameter. When you're writing your own code, what you really want to do is think about what you want to happen in this situation and whether or not the software that's calling it can handle an error. So the one I was working with doesn't handle a response at all. So I didn't want to send back any sort of error because it wasn't going to do anything with it. And really make sure that as you're testing that you test all the possible scenarios and that you don't make any assumptions about your caller. For example, one assumption I had made was that since this is coming from Facebook Chatfuel, everyone on Facebook has a first and last name, right? You have to have a Facebook account. But for some reason, the chatbot in like 1% of circumstances was not sending us the first name. Don't know why, it just wasn't happening. They couldn't tell us why. So I actually had to add code later to handle a null first name, to like plug in a default value because in our instance, everyone has a first name. So really just make sure that you're checking your assumptions and that you're handling all the possibilities that the caller will send. And then limits. Actually, I was talking to someone and they reminded me I had to talk about limits because we have a large org with a lot of users and we have a very high API limit. So it's not actually something I actually ever think about. But the limits on how many API calls you can get depends on the type of org you have and the number of licenses you have. So it depends on the addition and it depends on how many full licenses you have. So it's some multiplier of that. There's two different types of limits. There's the number of concurrent long-running calls. So if you have an API that takes a long time to run, and by a long time I mean over 20 seconds, you can only have, I think it's 5 of those running at once. If a 6th call comes in and there's still 5 of these running, it's going to fail. And then there's also a limit on the total number of API calls per rolling 24-hour period. So if you make too many calls within a 24-hour period, the caller will get an error as well. You can increase your limit temporarily by contacting support. If you know you're going to have some surge and you're already close, they can increase it temporarily. Or if you need a permanent increase, you can contact your account executive and they're happy to take your money for it. You can check where you are at any moment in time by going to your system overview in setup. And you can also set up usage notifications to send you emails if you're getting close. So for example, if you want to send a notification when you're at 80%, you can do that and it'll send you an email when, that way you can go and see what's going on, see what's, whether you need to increase your limits temporarily, et cetera, et cetera. And then just some links to some additional resources that were really great. The Trailhead for Apex Web Services is really good. I linked to some docs about custom REST web services, as well as a standard REST API that you can use to do a lot of, there's a lot in the standard REST API, so check that out. And then I also linked to a blog by Wade Wagner, who talks about creating these anonymous REST APIs using Salesforce sites, which is what I had shown briefly today. And then the gist for today's demo code. And I think that's it for me. So
I had a quick question, Tammy.
Yeah.
I may have missed it. So when you talk about sites, can you go back into the setup? And
Yes.
I saw where you assigned like the Apex class to be available. But then when you were doing that SOAP UI example, you
Yep.
said, now I'm not going to an instance URL, I'm going to a site URL.
Yep.
How did you get that site URL? I don't think I've done that before.
Let's see. So let me go to setup. If I go to sites, so here's that site URL here. So if I click on it, you can see the full thing as well.
I forgot, I missed that. Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anything I got wrong that you want to point out? Please do.
I have a question, actually. So just trying to think through, I know when I've done HTTP callouts before, I have to write mocks, right, for my test classes I can't call out to an external service during my testing. Is the reason you don't need to do mocks with this because you're just creating dummy test data in your test and using that, and you're not actually calling out anyway?
Yeah, you're not calling, in this case, the test class is testing an incoming request. It's not testing a call out. So the HTTP mock is to mock a response you might receive from an external service. In this case, with that add header and add params and those methods, you're mocking an incoming call.
Got it.
So it's not called a mock, but it's sort of the reverse of an HTTP mock.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Jennifer said, thanks. I was wondering how mocks played into this too.
Awesome.
Who else has some questions?
Really quiet today.
Yeah, you guys are super quiet. That just means Tammy did a fantabulous job, right? Right, later.
Confused you all.
No.
That's great.
And I'll post my slide deck and all the sample code. So feel free to hit me up with any questions later as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you guys have questions regarding this, or if you want to have a conversation, just continue it absolutely in the community. So Jennifer said, no, it was really good, clear and informative. Nadina said, you were amazing, Tammy. And then
Jen Weaver said, you did a fabulous job.
Oh, thank you.
Meyer said, thank you so much. Y'all are so awesome.
Blanca said she really did.
Alice is super helpful. Always be learning, of course, Umas. Helpful Saturday lady.
Jessica says she can't unmute to say yay. Oh no!
Wait, I'll say it for you. Yay!
And with that, we're at the end. Have you ever created a custom REST API? What are your top tips for using REST API and REST Web Services? Comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you've made it to this point, we want to take an opportunity to say thank you. Since you stayed with us, here's a bonus. Postman is a great tool for testing out API endpoints and has replaced SOAP UI as Tami's default tool of choice. Thank you for spending time with us. Make sure you like this video. It helps a lot. Click subscribe and on the notification bell so you never miss another video. We also handpick these videos, which we recommend you watch next. You can talk to us on Instagram, Twitter, and on our website at 100daysoftrailhead.com, all of which are listed below. Thank you for learning with us, and we'll see you back tomorrow.